Immigration is the issue that appears to be central to everything happening in Canadian politics right now. Hello, my name's Brian Lilly, and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. Whether we're talking about problems with housing supply, our healthcare system being under duress, the Trump tariff threats, immigration is at the center of it. Now, for the longest time, Canada had a fairly robust immigration system and widespread acceptance of high-level immigration numbers. Things have definitely changed when you look at the polling from groups like Leger for the Association of Canadian Studies. But why is immigration central to all of the stories I just mentioned? Thankfully, we've got a guest with us today who knows the system well. He was immigration minister in the Harper government for many years. He's been involved in politics for decades, former premier of Alberta, former federal cabinet minister, all-around good guy, Jason Kenney. Jason, thanks for the time.
Good to be here, Brian.
So, let's just back up a second and find out where you're at these days, because you've been in the public eye for a long time, and then you weren't. And last time I saw you, you were sporting a Ted Cruz beard and looking fine and relaxed. You're clean-shaven now. Where are you at, and what are you doing?
Wow, the Ted Cruz beard. I mean, you've got to be a political junkie to think of it that way. Yeah, somebody was telling me that the beard made me look prematurely old, but I am getting older. I'm happily in the private sector. I have something like normalcy in my life for the first time, maybe just about ever, because, Brian, I was in elected life for 25 years. And you know that I was always kind of hard charging, 90-hour week kind of guy. And before that, I had helped to start and found the Canadian Taxpayers Federation in my 20s in the 1990s. And that was a wild ride as well. So since leaving public office almost exactly 2 years ago this week, I have been building up a lot of different interesting things in the private sector, in business, corporate boards, some advisory work. I'm also involved in think tanks like the C.D. Howe Institute. But I am starting to get to I had the view I had spent 25 or 30 years where one of the most dangerous places to be in Canada was anywhere between me and a microphone. I wasn't shy about my views, and I thought, I've had my say. Let other people have theirs. But I am starting to do some more public commentary on issues that really matter to me, and one of those is certainly immigration.
And that's why I wanted to reach out to you. I was looking at everything that's been going on the last little while. And for people that don't know how hard-charging Jason's life was when he was in office, every now and again I would send you a private message or email trying to find something out, and I would get a reply in the middle of the night, and that would often be you going to bed. So, I mean, that's the type of life.
My poor staff used to complain about the texts they would get from me for 2, 3, or 4 in the morning. I said, you don't have to reply then. Relax.
You'd send Jason an email, and 2 days later at 3 a.m., you get a reply. So let's talk about the state of immigration. Just from a 40,000-foot viewpoint, where do you think our system is not now compared to where it was, just wide-angle view?
So, Brian, Canada used to be regarded as having the best immigration system in the world, or one of the best. In fact, when I was Canada's longest-serving immigration minister in history, 5 years in that role, but also 10 years, almost 10 years, as Minister for Multiculturalism, which is kind of immigration adjacent. And so I think I got a pretty good insight into the system, and also led very deep and broad reforms. And I can tell you almost every week I had delegations of political leaders or think tankers coming from Europe and around the world to say, how have you got this right in Canada? I also had political leaders coming from all around the Anglosphere saying, how come you Conservatives in Canada have done so well electorally amongst immigrants to your country? So I think the answer is that we had, if you look at post-war immigration to developed countries like Europe, for example, in the post-war period, they brought in a lot of guest workers, what we here would call temporary foreign workers, typically to work in lower-skilled trades, occupations, in primary manufacturing. And they often came from former colonies of those countries, like people from, Bangladesh and South Asia coming into the northern British manufacturing cities, people from the former French colonies of North Africa, the Maghreb, coming into parts of France. Unfortunately, not a really a brilliant experience, where many people ended up in those communities stuck in ghettos, arriving with modest levels of education, little or no European language proficiency, and modest levels of skills. And so there was not much social mobility. And I would also say maybe those were less welcoming societies than Canada with their own tradition of pluralism. Here in Canada, post-war, we developed under Diefenbaker in the late 50s and then in 1968, the points system, what we call a human capital model, that selected economic immigrants, at least in part based on having higher levels of education, English or French language proficiency, and other criteria that we knew would lead to success. And we had, I think, instead of bringing large numbers of people from one or two countries or one or two cultures, we had quite a good international mix. That led to better integration, higher levels of education, more social mobility, and generally a positive experience. I'm not saying the immigration situation in Canada was perfect, but every scholar around the world, the data said we were doing very well.
Well, I can tell you that when my parents came here in 1968, it took them about 4 to 5 years, and they were able to buy a house. They were able to move upwardly in ways that they weren't back in the old country. And that was the story of my whole neighborhood. And they came from all over in my neighborhood.
Exactly that. And in fact, it used to be that selected economic immigrants to Canada were making, in terms of their income, higher than average incomes within 10 years of their arrival, which is pretty amazing social mobility. And also, by the way, I've always said that immigrants are by nature entrepreneurial. The very decision to come to a new country, leave behind what's familiar, is a risk-taking, entrepreneurial decision. So I'm not surprised that historically new immigrants are twice as likely as native-born citizens to start a small business or start a business. Now, having said that, one other point. Because of that generally positive experience, and I'll be honest, because of our geographic remoteness, which has limited illegal migration that we're seeing huge waves of into the U.S. and Europe, because of those factors, we had a broad public support for immigration. We really stood out in the democratic world, in the developed world, as having the most broad pro-immigration consensus across the political spectrum. Unfortunately, that's over. And that's over because Justin Trudeau took the best system in the world and essentially turned it on its head. He did almost everything wrong on this. And I'm sorry if that sounds partisan, but he was my critic. And by the way, when I was immigration minister, he was my liberal critic. And I could tell he never paid any attention to the details. He found the policy side of this stuff boring. He just would always repeat these liberal cliches and bromides about diversity being our greatest strength. And I think he came to office with the idea that because immigration's good, more must be better. And so he took off the idea that we should have reasonable levels attached to Canada's absorptive capacity, by which I mean your ability to find people good jobs and housing, healthcare, schools for their kids, infrastructure to support growing population. He paid no attention to that, opened the floodgates, doubled the target and the intake on permanent residents, and increased by almost 800% the intake of temporary residents, who are primarily foreign students and temporary foreign workers. He's now basically shredded the old point system. I can explain how that's happened. Undone a lot of our reforms for integrity, like the asylum system, for example, refugee determination system. We had those numbers down to, I think an intake of 10,000 a year. It's now going to be 180,000 refugee claims this year. We had the backlog there down to a working inventory. We were processing claims in 3 months. It's now back up to a 3-4 year wait time with 250,000 people in the backlog. We basically turned the system on its head, and I'm only concerned it's going to get worse with Trump's commitment to, quotes, mass deportations and up to 20 million illegal foreign nationals in the U.S. We could see a huge wave of those trying to make it a Hail Mary pass by coming north.
Just to give people an idea of where support was and where it is now, It's not as if everyone thought our immigration system was great. There were still some people that some thought too many, some thought too few. But a study by Leger for the Association of Canadian Studies at McGill University in 2019 found that 65% thought that we were bringing just about the right number of immigrants. Now, the same study just done a couple of months ago, same question, same pollster, same organization, 35%. 35%. That's what support has gone down to, from 65% supporting the system to 35%. That's a disaster.
Yeah. Perhaps one of the worst legacies of this government will have been taking the most pro-immigration consensus in the developed world, something that was unique, and turning it on its head. And I think that's almost unforgivable. And by the way, what Trudeau has tried to do, in particular, and the left in general, is to say, if you ever question immigration policy or super high levels, you're a racist. They call people names. And unfortunately, what that does is push people. It suppressed a real proper debate on the issue, for starters. But secondly, Brian, I can tell you, and the polling proves it, that it is immigrants who are most likely to say they're opposed to high levels of immigration. Why? Because they're the folks who struggle most with, they're at the bottom of the housing market, right? They don't have an equity stake in the Canadian real estate market. So they're trying to rent and then save, and they can't afford a house. They're at the bottom of the job market. They don't get it's harder for them to get their credentials recognized.
Or I'll give you an example. A woman that I work with, immigrant from Lebanon. Her kids were born and raised in Canada. They're graduating school. One's graduated a year or so. Now, her son's about to graduate. They can't get jobs.
Yeah.
They can't get jobs. Youth unemployment through the roof. They can't afford to move out on their own, as many of us did when we either were in school or finished school. And I regularly talk to either people that came 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 30 years ago, who are complaining they screwed up the system. They screwed up the system that brought me here.
Brian, even when I was minister and levels were much lower, like 250,000 permanent residents and 1/8 as many temporaries, I remember doing a big news conference at the Royal York Hotel in downtown Toronto about some of my big immigration reforms. And there must have been 40 journalists. It was on live TV. First question went to the editor of a South Asian newspaper from Brampton. And he said to me, Mr. Kenney, I think he was from Pakistani origin. He said, Mr. Kenney, my 20-year-old son can't find a job. Why are you bringing so many newcomers to Canada when my son can't find a job? Now, you should have seen, to coin a phrase, the lily white CBC and Torstar reporters just about needed smelling salts. They were going to pass out. But here's my point. You know this because you grew up in an immigrant working class neighborhood. New Canadians are those who are most sensitive to unreasonably high levels of immigration. They're the last people to find a family doctor. It's toughest for them to get housing. It's toughest for them to get a good job. And so they're the most likely to say that numbers should be should be more manageable. I always used to say, Brian, that Canada is a welcoming and generous country, but there are obviously practical limits to our generosity. We cannot be the world's hospital. There are only, look, last year Trudeau added about 1.5 million people to our population in a country that built 220,000 housing units. Now, even if I think on average you say it's 1.5 people in those housing units. So let's say, I don't know, it's 2.3 people per housing unit. So let's be generous and say we're building an incremental 500,000 beds. He's still adding 3 times more to the population than incremental beds in a country that was already facing a housing crisis. This is not actually complicated. This was gross incompetence driven by this kind of gauzy-headed liberal ideology. Secondly, I actually think that by running these super high numbers, they imagined they were creating a partisan trap for the Conservatives. The Conservatives would step in and object to these numbers, and the Liberals would call them racist. And they think we always win that argument when we frame our adversaries as racist. Well, guess what? It's new Canadians who are saying this is out of control, and many of them are going back to their countries of origin because they can't afford to live in Canada.
The GDP per capita numbers are just out, and again, 6 quarters in a row. I think it's 8 out of the last 9 quarters. Our GDP per capita is down.
This was totally predictable, Brian. Let me say, in every country that has very high levels of sustained lower skilled immigration, you see declining per capita GDP. Now, I know that sounds like a fancy economic stat that's irrelevant to some people. Maybe don't understand why this is important. Per capita GDP means you take the entire size of the Canadian economy, you divide it by the number of people here, and when you have sustained declining per capita GDP, it means you are getting poorer as a country. Because of that, we are now at the level of per capita GDP as Mississippi, the poorest of the 50 United States. Well, over the past, since Trudeau came to office 9 years ago, I think per capita Canadian GDP over that period has grown by 0.6% in Canada, but grown by 16% in the United States. So we are falling behind dramatically. And it's not just the numbers, but the huge portion of people that he's picked who are low-skilled temporary foreign workers and people coming on. I hesitate to say foreign students because, look, I don't think anybody's going to argue that if Queens brings in somebody to their medical school, this is not a problem. But if you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people doing like 6-month diplomas at dodgy fly-by-night diploma mills that happen to have some kind of an arrangement in the case of Ontario with community colleges, those kids are not coming primarily for their education. They're coming for a work permit. They're coming because their immigration agents have told them they're going to get permanent residency and then citizenship. They'll be able to sponsor their family. It is a down payment on immigration. It's not about a study permit. And it's turned that whole program on its head. You add all of this together, you've got kids sleeping 20, 30 kids sharing apartments, sleeping in shifts, working around the clock. The Indian Consul General in Toronto told me every week he's sending body bags back to India of kids who have taken their lives because of the depression, the economic pressure. They have to send remittances back home. They can't afford to live here. They can't get the permanent residency that they were promised. It is a moral and humanitarian disaster that the government has also created.
Okay.
I'm sorry to sound so negative.
No, this is why we wanted to talk to you. You actually understand the numbers and the policy. But let's talk about the freight train that's coming at us.
Yeah.
Because the Donald Trump tariffs are not about an economic policy. It's that they're annoyed that our border mess up, our immigration mess up is now messing up their system. And when you look at the increase of people going across the Canada-US border from, a few tens of thousands a couple of years ago to 109,000 in 2022, 198,000 in 2024. And then you look at 43,000 of them are Indian nationals who came to Canada on some kind of visa and then go across and claim asylum in the U.S. Of course they're going to have an issue with what we're doing. Cleaning up that mess, in my view, it starts with cleaning up our own problem. So we've got a problem with a broken immigration system that's causing problems in our own country for everyone involved. And it's now causing problems with our closest trading partner, and therefore a threat of, if you don't fix your problems, we're going to impose this penalty on you.
Yes, and let me say that I kind of look at it different. Look, the U.S. has a long-standing and legitimate interest in northern border security and border security generally, particularly since 9/11. In Canada's defense, we did a lot post 9/11 under the Chrétien and Martin governments and the Harper government to improve border security. We brought in biometric digital passports and biometric visas and a information sharing agreement with the United States. The Harper government in particular really tightened up our asylum system. We've done a lot to improve that. And it's true that I think like 13,000 foreign nationals are found to be doing land border crossings illegally from Canada to the United States.
198,000.
In a year.
Yes.
Yeah, in a year. Which is like how many come across in a week or in a couple of weeks from Mexico. My point is the southern border is the real issue for the United States. And it's a real issue for us. This I do not understand. Why has the government of Canada not gone to Washington to say, you need to tighten up your southern border? Because we're getting way more illegal migration from the U.S. to Canada than vice versa. And it's largely coming from people who came in from the southern border that overstayed in the U.S., that have failed on their asylum claims, and are now asylum shopping by coming to Canada. And by the way, the fentanyl that's hitting our streets and killing people with addiction is most of it is being transshipped. The precursor chemicals typically go from China to Mexico. The product is cooked in labs in Mexico run by the narco cartels. It's run by coyotes across the U.S. southern border and then transshipped across to Canada. Here's my point. We have an interest in the success of the Trump administration in closing the U.S. border from illegal migration and drug trafficking. We should be working with him and work with the United States on that. And I think that would give us more credibility when it comes to protecting our interests.
You know, the issues that Trump is now talking about have been raised by the Biden administration previously, now in a much more diplomatic form, because that's the way the Biden administration operates, as opposed to Trump showing up with a baseball bat and saying, hey, here's my problem, fix it or you get this.
Right.
But they're a problem for both administrations. The Trudeau government has no interest in doing the heavy lifting on policy, though, is my view.
Yeah.
I talked to several people from several provinces who were on the call with the Prime Minister, talking about this with the premiers, and they all came away frustrated. And not all of them are opposed to this government, but they're all frustrated that, okay, the premiers had to call for a meeting. Doug Ford basically publicly shamed Trudeau into calling a meeting. And then when Trudeau shows up, after putting the meeting off for a day, there's no plan. And then we read in the Globe and Mail, two anonymous liberals saying, we'll have plans out in front of you in the weeks and months to come. That's a problem.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. And the reason Trump made this statement earlier this week is that he wants rapid action on this. He wants to come to office with already real momentum on border security, on drug interdiction. And you know what? He has every right to demand. That's his mandate. Now, I think it would be catastrophically bad for the U.S. economy to impose a 25% tariff on imports from Canada. I need to remind you, Brian, and perhaps Justin Trudeau could remind him, that 60% of U.S. oil imports come from Canada, 5 times more than from all of the OPEC countries combined. Mr. Trump won this election on a promise to cut gas prices in half. If he imposes a 25% tariff on the single largest source of U.S. oil imports, he'll be increasing and not cutting fuel prices for Americans. Yeah, so it makes no sense for the American economy, for him politically, obviously, but the Trudeau government needs to demonstrate it is serious about these issues, and I don't think we're starting with any credibility in Washington on that.
The oil exports are roughly 18.4 million barrels a day. Works out to current spot prices for Western Canadian Select at about $57. Yeah, about $1 billion a day. Adding on the 25% tariff would actually put Western Canadian Select at a higher price than West Texas Intermediate. So that would definitely push up the price. But I said earlier, I don't think he's doing this for economic reasons. He wants to do this to get a result on the border.
Right.
And while the economic argument of how much we trade with them is a good one that we always have to remind them, if that's your only argument, it's a bit like, well, your wife's really angry at you that you keep leaving your socks on the couch at night. And you say, but honey, don't you see how clean the garage is? Well, she's still going to be angry about the socks. So let's deal with the socks, and it'll help both of us.
Well, look, I agree, obviously, but the bigger issue that both Canada and the United States are suffering from is the open southern border. The fentanyl, by the way, the amount of fentanyl exports from Canada to the United States is negligible. Negligible. The amount of fentanyl imports coming from Mexico through the United States to Canada is enormous. Here's my point. If we're serious about protecting our own people, we should be joining up with the Trump administration to demand that Mexico cooperate in cracking down on the narco gangs and on border security.
It would give us more credibility.
Right.
We need to take a quick break, but when we come back, Jason, I want to ask you about the change in multiculturalism, because the change between how you, as Minister of Multiculturalism, as the Harper government viewed it, vastly different from what's going on with the Trudeau government now. More in moments. One of the other interesting aspects of the breakdown in support for our immigration system is perhaps, in my view, the way that the Trudeau government looks at multiculturalism, as opposed to the way that you looked at multiculturalism, Jason, the way the Harper government looked at it writ large. There's nobody standing up for Canadian values anymore, unless that value is diversity is our strength. I mean, other than that, what is a Canadian value from the Trudeau government? It's about multilateralism. It's about international institutions. It's about the rules-based order, and diversity is our strength.
Yeah, you know what? Imagine you're a new Canadian. Like, Brian, folks like you and I who won the lottery by being born in this country, I think we take a lot of things for granted. But imagine you're new to this country. You just arrived 5 years ago during the Trudeau administration. And you start listening to your leader talk about the country. What does he say about Canada? That we are not just a genocidal state historically, but engaged in an active genocide. That's his actual position, by the way. That we are irredeemably racist with systemic racism deeply embedded in our institutions. We are essentially an evil expression of colonialism, which needs to deracinate all of these institutions that are rooted in its colonial past. And that we have no core identity. We're the first postmodern society with no core identity. And why would you want to be proud of such a place? Why would you want to encourage your kids to go and, I don't know, maybe serve in the military, serve our country, or, a country which had its flag at half-mast for half a year, where you have municipal councils canceling Canada Day celebrations because we're supposed to be ashamed of instead of proud of Canada. This is what the left has done to our national identity. And I think it's outrageous. In a country that maintains high sustained levels of immigration, it is especially important that you have certain symbols, values, institutions grounded in its history, which are unifying, which are points of unity. And we do have those. By the way, Brian, it is not a coincidence that people around the world dream of and becoming Canadians. It's because they want to benefit from a society predicated on certain institutions and values, like equality of all before the law, parliamentary democratic institutions, the rule of law, free enterprise, private property rights, pluralism, and so on. Do
you know how many people I know were the first in their family ever to own property when they came to Canada?
Exactly.
That was the case in my family. To own land, I mean, you didn't do that in so many parts of the world unless you were super wealthy. And then we all come to Canada and we get to learn that. But somehow Canada is now the problem.
Right.
That wasn't the case. And that's not what when you were going out and you earned the nickname Minister of Curry in a Hurry. I mean, who was it at these events that was telling you Canada is a white settler colonial nation, that we need to engage in decolonization? Were you getting that?
Overwhelmingly high social economic status, Caucasian, overeducated Canadians with luxury beliefs. When I say luxury beliefs, you're a struggling newcomer to Canada, coming from perhaps a developing country, perhaps a country characterized by corruption, kleptocracy, abusive state authority. You come here to work hard and get ahead in a fair country, right? You're so happy with that opportunity and so focused on the hard work in front of you, you don't have time to get obsessed with these luxury beliefs of the intersectional left who are obsessed. By the way, you've seen now I've lost track of how many liberals have been caught inventing fake indigeneity, fake indigenous identity. Why do they do this? Because in the pecking order of intersectionality, where kind of social status is attached to your perceived minority status or your victim status, they all want a piece of that, right? When I became Minister of Multiculturalism, Brian, I looked at the program, the multiculturalism program run by Ottawa, the grants that we were giving. Overwhelmingly, they were grants, and this is going back to like the 2007-8 period, to left-wing organizations to go into schools to teach kids that they are either the unwitting perpetrators of white supremacy, colonialism, and the structures of privilege. That's what they teach, I guess, Caucasian kids. Imagine teaching a Ukrainian refugee child that because of this color of his skin. And then they would teach other kids that they are the unwitting victims of these structures of colonialism, white supremacy, and oppression. Why in the world would you want to go into a diverse society like Canada that works pretty well and teach everybody to distrust each other? Teach people that they are somehow involved in some cosmic racial struggle? This is nuts. That's where the left is coming from. And unfortunately, the Trudeau, I defunded all of that. We refocused the multiculturalism program on promoting civic literacy, by which I meant an appreciation for our historically grounded identity and common values, how we develop these institutions, patriotism, God forbid. When's the last time we heard people talk about patriotism?
Well, it's negative.
Yeah, building bridges between communities with a history of conflict. So we had programs to bring together, like, let's say, Canadian youth of Sinhalese and Tamil origin, Sikh and Hindu origin, Jewish and Muslim and so forth. And we try to do positive things like this. And we also promoted, as you know, civic literacy in deepening the citizenship program. We increased by 1 year the duration before you could become a citizen from 3 to 4 years. We brought in a much more rigorous language proficiency test, because if you don't speak the language, you can't fully participate in the society. We massively increased the knowledge requirement. You might remember our new citizenship study guide, Discover Canada,
yep,
which gave a very balanced, I think, and substantive knowledge of Canadian history. And we did all of these things. And then Trudeau, of course, pulled all of it out. We've gone back to billions of dollars of grants being given to radical left organizations to teach people effectively to hate the country, its institutions, and its history, and to distrust one another. It's going to take a long time to turn that around.
I'll even say this, and I'll give you an example. The left tends to fetishize immigrants in some very bizarre ways. That, they're all good and they're all coming from great places, and I don't know why they're coming to this horrible land. Here's one example. An immigration group, probably while you were a minister, an immigration group in Gatineau, Quebec, put out a pamphlet, Things You Should Know When You Come to Canada. And one of them included, don't bribe police officers or public officials, because in Canada, you can go to jail for that. Well, the group was denounced as horribly racist. How dare you say that people in other countries have bribes? And I'm standing there with one of the camera ops at the Old Sun News, Andre. You might remember Andre from Parliament Hill, Russian guy. And he said, that was the best advice I got when I came to Canada. Don't offer bribes. He said, in Russia, if we didn't bribe people, nothing happened. If you went to the government office to get something, you better be slipping some cash or it ain't going to happen. He didn't know that was frowned upon in Canada until somebody told him.
Exactly. By the way, we also said in Discover Canada, the citizenship guide that I published, that Canada's tolerance and diversity do not extend to certain barbaric cultural practices, including female genital mutilation, forced marriages, so-called honor crimes, and etc. Justin Trudeau came out as my critic and condemned this because he thought it was insensitive. But I'll tell you, Brian, the vast majority of newcomers who come to Canada do not come here to recreate the worst aspects of their cultures of origin, but to leave those things behind. And we have an obligation as a welcoming society to openly and thoughtfully convey what we mean by Canadian values. One of which is the equality of men and women. Mm-hmm. One of which is that we don't tolerate abusing people because of so-called honor crimes. If that's your culture, hey, how about you try not to bring those kinds of aberrant practices to Canada? It is, I think, incumbent on us to say those things charitably, but truthfully.
So, assuming that the polls are correct, the Trudeau government's on its last legs. We'll see how long they can keep standing. Maybe they fall in the spring. Maybe we go all the way to October. But let's say the polls are accurate and Pierre Poilievre becomes the next prime minister. We have no idea who he put in to this file, but where does the heavy lifting have to begin to fix all this?
Well,
given that you've done some of it in the past, where do you start to fix this and make it so that Canadians aren't becoming as skeptical of immigration as their southern neighbors?
Well, fortunately, there is a roadmap in that Canada did have there was a cross-partisan consensus about what we called a human capital model for immigration. The Harper government in particular led very positive reforms that were endorsed by newcomers in elections. So I think there's both a political and a policy map to follow. But first, you're going to have to clean up the damage done by Trudeau. Now, that involves, for example, the fact that by next year we'll have nearly 5 million foreign nationals on temporary visas expiring or have expired in Canada. So we're going to be facing it. We don't know how many people here overstayed illegally whose visas have expired. We will have millions more falling out of legal status. Now, many, I hope most of those people will do the right thing and voluntarily go back to their countries of origin.
And some of them always plan to. But do you really think all 4.9 million are going to do that? Mark Miller does.
Particularly because many of the foreign students that came did so on the commitment they got from often dodgy immigration consultants who they paid huge amounts of money to, that somehow their 1 or 2 year study permit with an attached work permit was going to lead to the gold standard of international migration, which is Canadian permanent residency and the right to sponsor their families. So many of them will stay here. And because of the dysfunction of the system, they'll say, and by the way, the word is already on the street, being promoted by the immigration consultants and all these WhatsApp discussion groups, that they're not going to be removing people because the CBSA, the Canada Border Services Agency, which is responsible for immigration enforcement, border security, last year, they're only resourced to remove about 13,000 people a year. So if we're talking about millions of people here illegally, and then you add on to that the potential massive flow of illegal migrants in the United States trying to avoid Trump's mass deportations, upwards of 20 million people. Mm-hmm. Now, I think we could be looking at hundreds of thousands or, God forbid, potentially millions of so-called illegal aliens in the United States that will try to head north, particularly if Justin Trudeau is prime minister. So we may be headed towards a really catastrophic situation. This will not be easy for a Poilievre government. They're going to have to, in my view, significantly increase removal resources for the CBSA. There's no way they can remove millions of people, but if we show that we're at least remotely serious about enforcement, that does send a dissuasive message for more people to come here, illegally. Mm-hmm. Clean up the asylum system in the same way that we had done in the Harper administration. Where necessary, impose visas. The Trudeau government, as you recall, they lifted the visa on Mexico. Tens of thousands of largely unfounded asylum claims came from there. So there's a whole series of things that have to be done together in a coordinated way to send a message. But still, I'm concerned it will take years to clean up the sort of backlog of challenges that they have created.
I remember you going to deal with, we had two problems at the same time. Huge influx of fake asylum claims from Mexico.
Yeah.
And also the Roma. We're not allowed to call them gypsies, but who did you go see to solve it? You went and visited the Gypsy King, not the band, not the multiple Gypsy Kings.
I'm a fan of that band, by the way.
You went to go see the Gypsy King in, I believe, Hungary, wasn't it?
Yeah, in Miskolc, Hungary. That's right.
Yeah, and so we had to impose visas on both of these countries just to be able to deal with it. What does that entail? Explain that for people that haven't dealt with that before.
Well, if you come to Canada and you you get a step off the plane, you come up to a port of entry, you say to the CBSA officer, I am experiencing persecution. They say, fill out this form. You then become an asylum claimant. You are then entitled to a publicly funded housing. Right now, that means they'll put you up in a hotel. You get access to free, unlimited, publicly funded health care. You get income support, welfare effectively. You get an open work permit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And because the system is now so overwhelmed,
44 months.
Look at your application for years.
44 months right now.
Oh, are you kidding me? No, it's like 2-3 years to get to the IRB.
Well, we have 44 months, so that's almost 4 years.
Right, exactly. 44. I think you said 4 months. And then, even if you finally get to the Immigration Refugee Board and they say, "I'm sorry, you're telling me that because you're gay and from Mexico, you're facing persecution, but by the way, you've got 4 kids with your wife. A, B, there is." Millions of people go to the Mexico City Gay Pride Parade and they have gay marriage. Like, what are you talking about? So they say, no, I'm sorry, that's not a well-founded claim. Then you make an appeal, and then you lose your appeal, and then you go to the federal court, and then you make an humanitarian and compassionate application. You can string it out for years, and what are you doing the whole time? Assuming that eventually they'll kind of lose track of you, or you'll finally just get waved into the country. So the incentives are very strong for people to make those kinds of claims, which is why you need to use lots of multiple tools in the toolbox, one of which is visas, so you can actually do a qualitative screen of people who are more likely to make claims of that nature.
And just say, you're not welcome in the country. You can't come here before you get on the plane.
Lots of countries as a Canadian you need to get a visa or at least electronic travel authorization. This is normal. It's not inhumane. It's a terrible thing. It's just a normal way of controlling border integrity. And one thing I can tell you is that a conditioned precedent of maintaining public support for legal immigration is that you have a rules-based system that prevents, to the greatest extent possible, large-scale illegal migration. Where you have a situation like in the U.S., millions, or Europe, millions of illegal migrants arriving every year, you have very little public support for legal immigration. So I would say to pro-immigration Canadians, if you want to maintain or rebuild public support for legal immigration, we need to reestablish the integrity of our system. That means things like visas. It means a faster, more efficient asylum system. It means greater immigration security screening, et cetera.
Well, this is going to be the hot topic for the next several years, I believe, because of the Trump tariff threats, because of the Trump deportation threat, and what you just described, that we could be facing a huge influx north. This is going to be a massive story in Canada for the next several years. So I'm glad that you're coming out of hibernation and starting to offer your thoughts. Really appreciate your time today, Jason.
Thank you, Brian. It was a pleasure.
Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Remember, you can subscribe to Full Comment, and please do, whether it's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the new YouTube podcast platform, wherever you are. Help us out. Leave a review, give us a rating, and tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.